want to grab our seats. We're going to welcome our next guests here. We're going to talk about road mapping today. So guys, come on up. We have Jackie Bavaro, the head of product management at Asana, and also the author of Cracking the PM Interview, and Latif Nanji, who is the co-founder and CEO of Roadmunk. So to kind of set the stage, I want to get since we're going to be talking about road mapping, what is the high-level philosophy that you take into road mapping that you bring to your companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at a high level, I would say that I'm fairly agnostic to the process. A lot of organizations, depending on the context of the product they're building, you could be in a large organization and have a brand new product that really doesn't warrant something very far out. And then you look at the other extreme side of that, and if you're a pharmaceutical company looking to plan out 10 to 20 years on a new drug discovery or distribution, you've got something that's just off the charts really long and has really critical milestones that you need to hit. And so when we look to work with our customers, or we look with people that are just doing road mapping in general, it has to do with sort of the maturity of that organization, the context of the product, and how they're looking to capture that market, even sort of before they're formulating the strategy in that. So usually when we think of road mapping, we're always talking in this context of software because, that's what's eating the world and that's the mindset we're in. But what we've learned from our customers is that there's a much broader scope out there that is now more familiar to me, and so we have to be mindful of that when kind of considering what the options are in that world.
Absolutely.
Nice. So the way that I like to think about road mapping is it's one of the 3 key parts of a strategy. So when you're thinking about the strategy for your company, there's going to be your framework, which includes your mission and your goals. And then you'll have a vision, which is the idea of this is where we want to get to in the future. This is how much better things could be in the future if we achieve our goals. And then your roadmap is a plan for how you achieve your mission or how you achieve your vision. So that's how I think about road mapping. It's the step-by-step plan of how you're going to get from here to your eventual vision. And it doesn't have to be the only plan, but it's really important to get something down so that you know and you can check that you're taking big enough steps to eventually achieve your vision.
So at Asana, how far out are you guys looking on the roadmap?
So at Asana, we do a few levels of planning, and we do have one roadmap, which is actually our long-term roadmap, which is roughly grouped by year and goes out probably 3 or 4 years, and really is everything to get to the vision. And then what we go on. The roadmap that we use more often is our annual planning roadmap. So we, once a year, do a big planning cycle, come up with a bold vision for where we could be in a year, and we have a great process where we incorporate, we call it Voice of the Customer. We incorporate feedback from all of the customer-facing teams, and build out an annual plan that includes which teams we're going to have, how big they'll be relatively, what are the top projects for each team, and approximately quarter by quarter when they might be delivered. And then we do a big check-in in the middle of the year when we might make major changes, and every quarter we do smaller check-ins to make sure that we're on track or to see if we want to adjust anything.
And you actually make staffing decisions based on the roadmap, right?
Yeah,
Which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. So we do sort of when we build our roadmap, we look at it from a few directions. So one of them is sort of top down. We think about what are the major initiatives we want to go after on any year. So we'll create our company objectives, and we'll think about from a balanced sense how much do we want to invest in each of these different objectives. So we might, so for example, 2 of the objectives that we frequently are thinking about are versions of how do we make Asana more powerful and how do we make Asana easier to use. And so for any given year, we might say, this year we're going really big after easy to use. It's going to be more of an 80-20 split. Or this year it might be more 50-50 between these 2. So we'll plan out and think about, are all of the balances of how we're allocating things make sense? And then we'll use that to say, okay, well, we need a really big team on this effort, or we need 2 or 3 teams on this effort, and decide that for another team we might have just a smaller team.
Very nice. Let's open it up for some questions. That's what we're here to do. Right here in the front.
All right. Question actually similar to the previous one that I asked Gib around voice of customer is what is your process to bring that into the roadmap? And my second question would be, do you use a framework of prioritizing or it changes every year?
So for the first one, voice of the customer, the way that we do this process is it's grown from originally I asked each of the team leads for their top 10 list. And I would take all of these top 10 lists and look at them and say, okay, I kind of like what sales wants for their number one, and I kind of like what our customer support team wants for their number two, and I would merge these together. And what we've grown from there is a process where each of the teams, each of the customer-facing teams is going to create a top 10 list based on input from everybody on their teams. And this will include things about what they're hearing from customers, their own judgment of what seems to be the most salient points that are coming through. And then we do a merged ranking based on weights of how we want to be weighting those different customer-facing teams, create an overall ranked list, and then our business leaders go in and as a team, they readjust the list and insert new things. So, for example, when we went after internationalization, that didn't come up on any of the team's top 10 lists, but the business lead said, hey, we need to go after internationalization next year, we're gonna insert that in. And so it starts off with a mathematical merge, but then gets this layer of judgment applied to make sure that people feel really good about it. And that's not the only input into our roadmap, but it is a major one. And one of the benefits there is it really helps make sure that we can hear from all of the different people who have different points of view on how, and different perspectives on what our customers want and need. And also because of the way that that process works, it helps people have a lot of faith across the company that that their inputs have been considered and that we're being very customer focused in our roadmap.
Yeah, I think when we look at the voice of the customer, my first reaction is the strategy in place has to be really sound. So for example, executives, PMs, and certain members of the team, if they're not on the front lines doing support, have to have a cadence with certain sets of customers and understand their strategy of who their target market is. I think if you're a B2B SaaS company or a B2B enterprise company, for example, you might hear a lot of noise of the same complaints at a higher volume from your SMB segment. But if you're not in tune with the customers you're trying to capture at a larger scale, your ability to filter through that information is really hard. So you have to have a good strategy to say, look, I'm going to visit these number of customers, get these inputs. And then you want to look at that and say, okay, what's my win-loss strategy? How am I ingesting survey information from different segments of the market? And then once you actually have that capability and funnel to hear all that information, then how is the product management team saying, okay, if we're going after this strategy in this market, what are the scorecards of information for whether it's feature sets, problem sets, feedback we have? Because the voice of the customer that's going to be loudest is probably sometimes, and even in our case, is not necessarily the market segment we're going after. And so when we're talking to the front lines or even sometimes junior product managers, they're happy to scream as loud as the loudest length of longest number of customers that may not be where we're trying to head. And so it's really important to parse through all of those lists, make sure that you have a good strategy for ingesting information, and then getting around a round table and then having those deep conversations before throwing something up, whether it's through the roadmap or a prioritization scheme that makes sense. My favorite is always balancing between the Kano model, just at a high level, because it just puts things in 3 buckets. It also lets you allocate time between the things that are going to delight your customers, be the things that are going to perform, and then your non-negotiables that are never going to make them more than 50% happy. And so when you can distribute some percentage of your resources against that, it really sets the frame for your team to communicate this is how we have decided to build those things, but also plan against those chunks of time. So,
Right here.
So first, do you do continuous discovery? And if so, how do you incorporate that into your roadmap in a responsive way?
Do either of you do continuous discovery?
So we do a little bit of it. I think we're an early organization since we're less than 100 people. For us, our design team and our growth team really tackle that area, so they'll be constantly looking at information and data through our A/B testing framework. I'd say we're still early on in our first 6 months and year to doing that as an organization. So to be quite candid, I can't say that we have a formalized process to probably the degree that maybe Asana or Slack has.
I don't know the official technical definition of continuous discovery. The way that we do discovery work at Asana is every project that we pick up goes through the double diamond model. So we start with product discovery, refine to a target audience, do a solutions kickoff, think expansively about solutions, and then deliver. And the way that we incorporate into our roadmap is we do have a lot of staggering between when we're doing research for something and when we're doing the engineering. So it's definitely one of the challenges of a yearly planning model, but a lot of times we'll have a strong guess, for what might be important the next year. And we will kick off a research project a year earlier or a few months earlier so that we can have enough research done to be able to start it up in the middle of the year or the next year.
Yeah, I think if you're using the definition that Jackie is addressing there, where you build something and you put it out into the world and then don't do anything about it, and you want to continuously understand if that thing's valuable, absolutely. That is table stakes right now if you're going to build a world-class product. You need to know how that feature is impacting your users, if your hypothesis is true, and in fact, some conversations last night, you should be putting bets down with your team. You should be actually saying, this is my hypothesis, let's bet on it. The visceral reaction when you win or lose will be a great learning experience. So, that's something that I think, at least I know that I'm going to incorporate going forward from conversations last night.
Let's go in the back. Sorry. We haven't taken any standing questions yet.
I don't know if either one of you guys are doing Scrum or Agile, but how do you balance road mapping with Scrum and Agile?
Yeah, it's so there's a very simple way to do this in my mind. Roadmaps, again, I think there's this thing that says a roadmap has to be 6 to 12 months or it has to be a certain way. I think right away if we just remove that from the conversation and say, for your organization, if you aren't using Agile and Scrum and you're planning 1 or 2 weeks out and you've got these things out, why do you need a roadmap that's 3 or 6 months, right? Who's the audience for that? Product management, the concept of this in the first place. So in my head, given my position, I need to communicate to leaders in the organization. I need to communicate to investors my plan, and so I can still work with my engineering team to get what they need weekly, but my marketing team may need to plan out a month or two to kind of roughly understand what's going on, right? My sales team, if they're working with their numbers on a quarterly basis and they have these 3 to 6 month sales cycles, depending on what market you're talking about, they're going to need to understand how they're communicating what's being delivered. Does that mean that it's a statement of commitment? No, it's a statement of intention. And when a sales rep, anyone asks, hey, why is it a statement of intention? I just respond back, it's just like your sales pipeline. It's a statement of intention, not commitment.
Just one trick that I sometimes use when I'm thinking about this is there's more than one kind of date, and I like to talk about the confidence level attached to a date. And so some of the ways this could work is say, like, there's one date that's like, hey, if everything went perfectly and we didn't hit any snags and our customers loved exactly what our smallest imagination of the product was, this is how soon we could possibly launch it. And so maybe that's your 25% confidence date. And then you've got the date that you're actually guessing, based on your own experience of when something might be ready. And that's maybe your 50% confidence date. You assume a few things will go wrong or a few extra features will be needed. You don't know exactly what they are yet, but you can make a guess. And then there are other dates where you're saying, maybe these are the dates that go into your financial planning model, where you're like, well, I'm 95% sure we're going to have something out the door by this date. And that might be, you might end up having a several month gap range in between the beginning, your 25% date, and your 95% date. But being able to talk about how confident you are in those dates and explaining the ranges in that way can help you and your team and the people receiving those dates understand the context so that you're able to be honest about dates and still give ones that aren't overcommitting.
Very nice. Over here on the side, in the blue.
Thanks. Jackie, earlier you said that going into the year, it's a balance between ease of use and power. 80-20 is one number thrown out. How do you come up with that number?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer for when you're coming up with your roadmap to think of it as a balanced portfolio and to think about it as different things you might put against each other, like ease of use and power. One year we had it as winning big teams versus everything else. And like you were saying, you can talk about delight versus must-haves, eng debt versus other things. You can also think about like big risky bets versus like, easy wins. And the way that I think about these percentages is actually really simple, which is you throw out your idea of like what your first guess is of like, hey, 50-50. And then once you actually have a conversation with other people, you'll be able to figure out from people's gut feels and their experience of, yeah, that sounds about right, it sounds close enough. Or, whoa, that's way off than what I thought we were gonna be doing. Let's have a deeper discussion about whether we should be investing more or less. And so it doesn't have to be mathematically precise, but those percentages will actually create a real reaction from people in the room. And I find that they're very effective for narrowing the conversation in on what to surface what people's agreements and disagreements are.
Over here on the side.
Hi, so I'm from a smaller organization where we're starting to scale up our product team. And I was more curious about the product team's involvement in roadmap planning. I love what you say about, getting the other teams involved and getting their input, but is the entire product team involved in the roadmap, in the annual roadmap planning, or is it something that comes from the lead and then the other product managers are kind of looped in with the other stakeholders?
It's a great question.
That is a good question. It's so contextual. For example, if you have a sales or marketing CEO, they may be more inclined to pass that on to the CTO or the head of product. If you're a product CEO, you're going to be heavily involved with that product team. To your point about what does the product team look like and how does that conversation happen, a lot of the times, depending on the size of the organization and how tenured those people are, I've seen it where maybe an intermediate PM is completely happy to run with that lead and work with the two of them versus some new people that are senior that don't necessarily know the entire market. So ultimately, you definitely want the VP or director or the head of product at that organization to be rallying and championing the roadmap in every way possible and own it to the nth degree. Like that's definitely table stakes in that conversation, but I think it's really important for the product organization to learn together. And if they don't have that experience, this is a great time to get that experience, and they should go through that journey together if possible, right? Again, it depends a little bit more contextually. It may take a little bit more time, but that to me is a worthwhile experience, especially if you're on your first iterations of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that we've definitely over time at Asana experimented with various levels of involvement from different people, but we always include an open call for anybody at the company to speak up now if there's something that they think is important for the next year's roadmap. And as we do the levels of saying, like, get feedback from everybody on the team, the group of PMs is one of the groups that will get a glance at the draft roadmap earlier before other people. So depending on exactly what the role is, some teams will be very involved. So for example, at Asana, for this year, we had a team that was building timeline, which was one of our features that, coincidentally is very nice for building roadmaps with. But we knew that we were going to build a feature called Timeline. We were pretty deep into the planning cycle. We knew a general sense of what it would look like. Whereas there was another team that was going to work on improving the first experience in Asana. And so for the Timeline team, the actual project and some of the details of what was in scope and out of scope, we did talk about at that annual planning process, and that PM was deeply involved. For the first experience, we sort of just carved off this black box bucket and said, hey, we're going to have a team of this size working on it for this long. They're going to figure out their projects later. And the PM wasn't involved in the annual planning process, but then they did their entire road mapping for that team later.
Right here in the on the side. You got the running shoes on though, so.
Hi, I had a question. How do you talk about and separate problems versus solutions when you talk about your roadmaps, especially long-term roadmaps, considering you might not understand it yet or they might change? How does that work for you?
I can talk about it.
Yeah.
This is, I think, a really great question, and one of the things that I'd say is probably one of the top things we're trying to improve on the way we do road mapping today. So I don't think we've got it perfect yet. So we've gone both ways. So a lot of this, I would say, comes from this idea of vision. And so from my point of view, an important part of a roadmap is some sense of when things will be delivered. And like you were saying, you can't cost a problem, you can only cost a solution. So one of my favorite ways that we did this is I had 90 minutes with one of our eng leads, and we had maybe 30 or 40 different problems and features, a mixture of all of these on a list. And we just cranked through them, like, just a minute or two per feature. And I said, here's what I imagine a potential solution could look like. And we're like, okay, it would need this, and it's about the size of that project. And we just cranked through it, and we're like, okay, that's about 3 months, that's about 6 months, that's about 2 weeks. And went through all of them. And it wasn't going to be very precise. We didn't want to overdo how long we spent on it. But we knew that there was at least some potential solution out there that would cost about this much. And then the teams were free to come up with something much, much better. But they could say that if the thing they came up with was better and cheaper, then no problem, they'll just fit it in and do it. If it turned out that it was better and more expensive, then we would have a real conversation about it. And we could actually say, well, okay, why are we going to choose? Is it better enough to be worth the extra investment?
Yeah, I definitely like that strategy. That's a really good way to do it really quickly. The one thing that let me just augment that is that sometimes when we look at roadmaps, they're the statement on whatever you're presenting sounds like a feature or a solution. And that really does actually work in some cases when you're presenting to an audience that knows exactly what we're talking about, because that's been conversations throughout their lifetime at that organization. It makes a lot of sense. When you start to talk about more innovative things that are maybe potentially more long-term, sometimes what ends up happening, and what we do, is we actually use problem statements towards latter parts of things that are maybe outside of a year. So maybe that first year of the roadmap is like, we're building this user profile thing or these settings. But then afterwards, like, we're going to tackle how to build this problem. And you just have that problem statement there. So it doesn't necessarily incite a solution or a direction. What it does is it actually says, hey, we want to go after that. If you have feedback, please tell us. Bring those customers and information towards us, because we want to hear more about that. And over time, we're going to transition that problem statement into something that the organization readily understands what that's going to look like.
Let's do one more right here in the front.
So how would you handle executives maybe kind of torpedoing your roadmap with ideas they just happen to hear on a podcast or read on a blog or any one of a number of other sources of bad ideas?
You really want to ask me that?
Who wants to dive in there?
Oh yeah, I will. This is great. So I think the stakeholder management in building a roadmap is super important, and the voice of the customer is one really nice way to handle this. Is you actually will create a list that your executives can see and say, here's what our customers are asking for, here's what we're seeing as the top signals, and then you can talk about the question of a balanced portfolio again, of like, hey, do we want to have you can figure out what their random request actually levels up to. Does it level up to the same need as something else on that voice of the customer list, or is it a brand new thing? And you can decide, do we want to have 5% of our roadmap towards, that entirely different objective, or even like, hey, 10% of our roadmap should be just things our executives think are important, and you get control over that 10%, and we'll find you some teams to do it. But another way is also, when I'm doing this building up, is we'll get the voice of the customer list, all the other inputs. I'll put together a draft roadmap, and I bring all of the stakeholders into a room, and I'm like, we're not leaving the room until we've all agreed on this. And so in that world, the executive is sitting at a table with all of the other people at the company who have really important things. And if their feature is going to push off things that other people care about, they're able to look face to face with the person whose need is going to be pushed off the list, and a lot of times that's enough to get people really honest and open and more understanding of what the real trade-offs are.
Early on in my career, I got completely sidelined by an executive for some work we were doing, and a customer had come in that they'd promised 6 months ago. And my lesson a year or two later from that, after having to stop everything I was doing for 3 months, we built this project out. It had very little value in the market. I was working for a traffic engineering kind of thing, so they were doing these things called red light studies. Did not need that. The market was way more interested in license plate recognition. And I realized at that point, if I didn't know the market and customer better than the executive, I was always at the risk of being swooped in on and being just being pushed to the side. And so my first thought was make sure I knew everything more than they did. And anytime a conversation was like, let's build this, my first reaction is, well, okay, first, maybe it's a good idea. But second is, if you want that, these customers, and I would name the customer, will then have to wait this longer for this other thing that you've asked me about. And that means I'm keeping close to them, they know the priorities. And so I'm training them when I was in that seat to basically say, here's the trade-off you're asking me to make. And if I have that right at my fingertips, I knew that they would have to be like, holy shit, okay. They'd have to think like the PM team very quickly. And I think that was a really good tool for driving a conversation in a positive direction.
Great advice. Yeah. Well, we're out of time. Huge round of applause for Jackie and Latif.